Trust you've all memorised that prayer by now. Okay. Throughout its history, the Church has been required time and again to defend the faith, to establish with one mind what it is exactly that the Church believes. The Fathers, as individual authors, could only do so much. To establish the Church's unity, the united voice of the whole Church needed to be heard, and not just voices crying in the wilderness. And so from very early times, the Church has tried to establish this unity in faith through what we call councils, the meetings of Church leaders, in which the Church, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, we believe, would express theological truths and establish unity in faith. The first such council that we know of is actually recorded in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles. The leaders of the Church met to discuss whether and to what extent the Gentiles, the Christians who were not Jews, should observe the Mosaic law. Metropolitan Gallistos describes the spirit of the council in this way. The apostles, when they finally reached their decision, spoke in terms which in other circumstances might appear presumptuous, for it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. Later councils have ventured to speak with the same confidence. An isolated individual may well hesitate to say it seemed right to the Holy Spirit and to me, but when gathered in council, the members of the Church can together claim an authority which individually none of them possess. But despite this meeting in Jerusalem, problems continued. We can already see in the epistles, in the writings of the Apostolic Fathers, as we saw last week, that disunity continued to agitate and perplex the life of the Church. Between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, the Church responded to the need to establish its unity in faith through the formulation of the New Testament canon. We've touched upon that several times, specifically when we talked in the second lesson on the New Testament. And this was largely in response to the Gnostic heresies. Like I said, a lot of fake Gospels and epistles and so on were written, and the Church had to establish what was the canon, of what was the authoritative text. But even that was not sufficient. In the 4th century, a new heresy came to plague the life of the Church, the heresy of Arianism. I remember in the handout in the first lesson when we talked about Trinity, I gave that to you, but you may not have looked at it or forgotten. Arius was a priest who basically taught that the Son was a created being, that he is not co-eternal with the Father. This gained huge popularity amongst the Church, and it wreaked havoc on the life of the Church. In many places the Church was really split into two, between the Arians and non-Arians, and it sort of continued to take on different forms throughout the centuries, and the Church again and again had to constantly clarify its teaching. And this was really what provoked what we call the First Ecumenical Council, and this was held in Nicaea in Turkey in 325 AD. It was summoned by St. Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor, and its chief purpose was actually to condemn Arianism. Sorry, I've lost myself now. Yes, and in response to Arianism, it began to try to clarify how to speak of the Trinity. And it was at the First Ecumenical Council that the creed we have today began to be formulated. It wasn't quite its complete form. The creed continued to develop in the Second and Third Ecumenical Council as well. And one of the most important figures in the establishment of the creed, in the teachings of the Ecumenical Council, was Saint Athanasius the Great. He was a bishop of Alexandria, and he's the person who invented the phrase homoousios, consubstantial, of one essence. And this was there was a big uproar in the church, because even those who were against Arianism, there were some who still refused to support Athanasius, because this word did not exist anywhere in the scriptures. It was not a New Testament word. And people challenged him and said, this is nonsense, how can you come up with this? It's worth remembering this, because a lot of people, when we think of the stringent traditionalists, the people that we today admire as saints and everything, they were actually quite innovative. They were very daring and inventive. Unfortunately, for a long time in our church, there's been a sort of stagnation where we just repeat whatever fathers have said. And obviously we have to be careful they don't get deluded and think, yes, God has enlightened me. And that's what heretics did. The saints, while they were humble and subjected to the will of the church, were also a lot more daring than we would like to imagine, to actually come up with a completely new word to defend the Orthodox faith. It was quite a remarkable thing. And this word homousios became such important. In fact, in the end, people were divided over one letter, the word I. There were people who said that Christ is homousios, of one essence, and others said he was homoousios, like the Father. And that I packed quite a punch in its day. In fact, it was such a key word that basically, if you proclaimed this word homousios, you were Orthodox. If you did not, you were not. And this obviously became incorporated into the creed, that we say that Christ is consubstantial with the Father, is of one essence with the Father. Indeed, in defence of Father Ephraim's translation, because a lot of people don't like this word consubstantial, they say it is nonsensical, and most people won't understand what it means. But he actually explained to me the reason he did this is because he wanted that one key word, just like you had this one key word in the Greek. He didn't want an explanation of the word or a translation simply, but wanted to capture that idea of the importance of this one word that defines your orthodoxy. And complementary to the work of St. Athanasius was that of what we call the three Cappadocian fathers: Gregory the theologian, or Nazianzus, Basil the Great, and his younger brother Gregory of Nyssa. While Athanasius emphasized the unity of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are in one essence, the Cappadocians stressed the threeness of God. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are three persons, or hypostases. And they basically together, they sort of preserved a sort of delicate balance between the threeness and the oneness in God. And they gave full meaning to the classic summary of Trinitarian doctrine, three persons in one essence. These are the fathers who really are kind of largely responsible for the Trinitarian theology, the doctrine of the Trinity in the Church. And never before or since has the Church had four theologians of such stature in a single generation. The work of Nicaea was taken up by the Second Ecumenical Council. By the way, if you want a list of the dates of the Ecumenical Councils in the first handout from the lesson on the Trinity, you will find them written there. I've included them there for you. The Second Ecumenical Council was held at Constantinople in 381, and this expanded and adapted the Nicene Creed. It particularly developed the teaching on the Holy Spirit. The reason being that we had again another heretical group called the Pneumatomachie. These were people who said that the Holy Spirit is not God in the sense that Father and Son are. And another very important figure in the work against the Pneumatomachie was St. Basil the Great. He wrote a very important treatise on the Holy Spirit, which became extremely influential in the Church. And as a result, the creed then developed. Originally, the creed about the Holy Spirit simply said, I believe in the Holy Spirit, full stop. Now we say, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, who together with Father and Son is worshipped and glorified, who spoke through the prophets. So clearly it was because, the Church didn't feel Christianity was about defining things, coming up with arguments. It wanted to simply live Christianity. But because there were these constant heresies, constant divisions, the Church time and again had to develop. And again we see the Church's willingness and ability to adapt to the needs of the time. The idea was the ecumenical councils were infallible. They could not be revised at all. But we ended up with 7 of them, not just one. Because every time new challenges and provocations came, they realised this was not sufficient. We have to explain further. And so the church does, tradition is something that has developed through the centuries. Often, when it's because it's under attack. Now, those who have studied theology, hang on. Yes, those who have studied theology and who know some of the Father's writings on the faith would be familiar with a lot of the things I'm talking about. But I wanted to also sort of pinpoint, when we talk about the Greek Fathers, the kind of climax in which this theology was written. For example, I think it was St. Gregory of Nyssa who he complained about how even he got fed up with all the theological arguments. There was a very witty letter somewhere where he said, you ask someone for how much a loaf of bread costs, and he starts talking about the begotten and unbegotten, and if you ask if your bath's ready, he says the sun was created out of nothing. And he's getting really... We forget in our untheological age what a burning interest was felt in all walks of life about theological matters. It was such a theological... But even the most simple of people were all discussing theology, where now no one seems to think it's important. But for example, I want to give you this other example of St. Gregory the theologian. What he says this: we worship the Father, Son and Holy Spirit. We observe the individual distinctions while numbering the Godhead as one. We are careful not to confound the three into one, so that we might not fall ill with the Sabellian virus. Sabellianism was the idea that the Father, Son and Holy Spirit were simply different modes of one person. Nor do we divide the Godhead into 3 different realities, in case we suffer from the Arian madness. We occupy the middle ground, observing the correct boundaries of righteousness. 2 things I want to point out here. First of all, the middle ground. I think I've said before, without wishing to be too simplistic, I would often think of orthodoxy as the middle ground when I look at the heresies, and also when it comes to the moral ideas as well. I find that the heresies always tend to be one extreme or the other. Either Christ is God or Christ is man. Either we turn the Mother of God into some superhuman being, or we don't venerate her as a saint at all. Either we're saved only by grace or we're saved only by works. And when I look at orthodoxy, I find there's something of a mix of the two. And the other thing I want to say is the way he talks about the heresies is virus and madness. The fathers didn't work in their quiet studies. The writing was forged in the furnace of fierce and sometimes violent conflict. The Arian emperors were persecuting the Orthodox, the Nicaeans, and many of the major dioceses were run by heretics. In the 4th century, what we call now the Orthodox were actually the minority. And you can imagine how they must have felt that this church, which has just now become the Church of the Empire, was basically on the verge of just being totally annihilated. I think it's important to remember that, because a lot of us are very pessimistic about the church today. We seem to think, the church has had its day. We have to try to sort of be more secular and so on. And when you look at the stuff they went through, but they were constantly defending what seemed so often as a hopeless battle that they would never win, and yet the church prevailed time and again. But also what was wonderful about the fathers is that they weren't just theologians. They were real examples of Christian virtue. For example, Gregory the theologian, when he arrived, when he was made a archbishop in Constantinople, he had to set up a church in a private house, as all the churches of the city were in the hands of the Arians. And at his very first Basca in 380, an Arian mob stoned the congregation and stoned him. They smashed the altar, desecrated the vessels. And one of his bishops was outraged, and they wanted to prosecute the aggressors. And this is what St. Gregory wrote to him. What happened was indeed dreadful. Our altars were insulted, our mysteries disturbed. It is important to obtain penalties for those who have wronged us, but it is far greater and more godlike to bear with injuries. The former course curbs wickedness, but the latter makes men good. Shortly after this, St. Gregory was visited by a young man. He came to with a group of well-wishers when he was ill in bed. And when the others left, he wept inconsolably, and Gregory wept with him. And after he cried, the man confessed that he had actually come there to assassinate him. And this is what St. Gregory writes. I was shocked to hear this, but managed to say something to absolve his crime. May God save you. It is nothing special that I should be kind to you, my assassin, since I too have been saved. Your rashness has made you mine. Henceforward look to how you can be a credit to God and to myself. And so here we don't just see the eloquent, erudite theologian and preacher. We see a man who has truly got the commandments of the gospel rooted in his heart. This turn the other cheek, love your enemy. And in the midst of it was a very violent time. I mean, let's not have any sort of naive idealism about the 4th century. Yes, it's the sort of the golden age of orthodoxy, all this theology. But what we don't see, what we have today, the problem with history is that when you look on it, what we look on is basically what has survived, which is the good stuff. We see the icons of theology. What hasn't survived, except people that examine it seriously, is how this came about. And it was in really, really violent times. And these fathers of the church I'm talking about, they are saints of the church, not just because they were important theologians, but because they were true Christians. And they are an example to us all because of that. The Third Ecumenical Council was held in Ephesus, 431, in Asia Minor. And this met to condemn another heresy, again another spawn of Arianism, if you like, Nestorianism. We've touched upon this before, but I'll explain it briefly again. Nestorius was a bishop of Constantinople. You notice these are all bishops. People complain about bishops today. You should see what the bishops were like back then. He refused to call the Virgin Mary Mother of God, Theotokos. And this was a title that was already accepted in popular devotion. But Nestorius felt, as many others did who followed him, that this was basically, he said you can't call her the Mother of God because she is the mother only of his humanity, not of his divinity. Right? Seems logical. If God is eternal, then surely he can't have a mother. Right? But the problem is that what happened is, what he effectively did was he separated the divine Christ and the human Christ into two different persons. The council responded with the words of the Gospel of John. The Word became flesh. So this person that is born is God himself. Therefore, she gave birth to God. This is obviously a mystery in the church, and if you read the hymns, and not just the dogmatic formulations, you'll see this throughout all the hymns. This mystery is constantly being pondered upon. And we often hear, how is it possible that the one who has no beginning is born? The Ancient of Days becomes a little infant. But that's precisely the mystery that is lost in Nestorius, that he basically says, it can't be possible, therefore she's not really the Mother of God, she's the Mother of Christ, which means Christ isn't God all of a sudden. You see why it was a big problem. This had serious repercussions for our soteriology. If Christ isn't God in the flesh, then he cannot save humanity. And another important father in this battle with Nestorianism was Saint Cyril of Alexandria, and the Council of Ephesus employed a lot of his writings against Nestorianism. And so, yes, this term Theotokos had basically been defended as, again, like the word homoousios, a key theological word. In the same way homoousios holds the doctrine of the Trinity together, Theotokos holds the doctrine of the Incarnation together. It is through that word that we understand what the Incarnation is about. God became man. The Fourth Ecumenical Council, 20 years later, in 451, was summoned in Chalcedon, and this met to condemn the heresy of monophysitism. and as that implies, it's one nature. These were people that believed that Christ only had one nature. He was only God or only man. There were different forms of it. And this obviously defended that Christ is both God and man at the same time. In the Proclamation of Faith, it says that we believe in one and the same Son, perfect in Godhead and perfect in manhood, truly God and truly man, acknowledged in two natures, unconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably. The difference between the natures is in no way removed because of the union, but rather the peculiar property of each nature is preserved, and both combine in one person and in one hypostasis. It's very technical language. I mean, it is difficult stuff to read. Basically, what it's saying is that we do not separate the two natures of Christ. He is at the same time God and man. He's not sometimes God, sometimes man. He's not, he doesn't cease being God through becoming a human. He's as divine in the crucifixion as he is human in the transfiguration. Unfortunately, though, this council, Arianism eventually died out, but this council created a split, which still survives today. Well, it didn't create a split, but basically there were churches which refused to accept this council, and they're often called non-Chalcedonian churches or monophysites, or some people call them Oriental Orthodox churches. And there are various, there's lots of them. You have the Armenians, the Ethiopians, Eritreans, the Copts. These are groups which basically they split from around sort of 4th, 5th century. What's interesting about them is that despite that split, they didn't go as far away from orthodoxy as, let's say, the Roman Catholic Church did. But nonetheless, this is still the main thing that keeps us separate. That we can't take communion in their church, they can't take communion in ours, although some of them are not aware of this. Eritreans in particular think it's all the same. But we have to resolve this issue in order. It's obviously such an important issue. We can't even agree on who Christ is. We cannot really, take communion together. So it's something that still hasn't been resolved after 1500 years. But hopefully, maybe one day it will. Then we had the 5th and 6th Ecumenical Councils. The 5th in 553, this reinterpreted the decrees of Chalcedon and sought to explain in more constructive terms how the two natures of Christ form a single person. The 6th Ecumenical Council, 680 to 681 AD, condemned a new form of monophysitism, monothelitism. The idea that Christ had one will. The monothelites argued that although Christ has two natures, because he is a single person, he has only one will. The council replied that if he has two natures, then he obviously has two wills, human and divine. The monothelites, like the monophysites, impaired the fullness of Christ's humanity. You cannot be a true human being without a will. And so they saw this, basically was a continuation of monophysitism, that Christ had a human will as well as a divine. You see this, for example, in the Gospel when Christ says to God, "Let this cup pass from me, but let it be as you will, not as I will." And where Christ says, "I seek not my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me." So Christ clearly, he had the divine will, but he also had the human will, which he subjected to the Father. So it was basically to preserve the integrity of his humanity, that if he's truly human. And I think Christians throughout the centuries have always, they seem to think that Christ was human, but he was this almost celestial being. But he hungered, he thirsted, he wept, he even got angry. There was the humanity. But on the other side, there are people that try to focus so much on that they forget that he was indeed the Son of God, who burst forth with light, who rose from the dead, who knew all things and knew the hearts and minds of everybody. So again, we have to avoid the extremes of turning Christ into this friend who sits on my shoulder and says, "Please do the right thing," and this God who's basically totally cut off from us and from our own experiences. Now, the Seventh Ecumenical Council we're going to look at next week. This is one that defended the icons, the theology of icons, the reason being that in the 7th century there was another persecution where people refused to accept icons. They saw them as idolatrous, and the icons were destroyed, and the venerators of icons were persecuted. This is, in fact, it might seem totally different from the other ones, but it's actually a continuation. This is directly connected with all the stuff we've been looking at about Christ and the Trinity, because the basic premise of this, we'll talk about this more next week, was that you can't paint God because God can't be seen. But the fathers answered, God has been seen. He became a human being. He sat before you, before people as you sit before me now. Therefore he can be depicted. He was human. And so the basic theology of the icon is that God became a part of the material world, the physical world. There's obviously a lot more to it than that. But we'll look at that next week. I just wanted to show you that that council is still connected with the Incarnation and the Trinity, like everything else is. What I want to look at now, briefly, and we've talked about the Ecumenical Councils, but I want to talk about two further councils. Most Orthodox speak of 7 ecumenical councils. When I was doing theology in Thessaloniki, there were a lot of theologians said there aren't 7, there are 9 ecumenical councils. And what they were talking about were 2 local councils held in Constantinople in 1347 and 1351 AD. These were technically local councils because there were bishops of a certain area that got together, which dealt with a problem in a certain area. It wasn't, the bishops from everywhere coming together. But the teachings of the council were so fundamental and so important that they became accepted by the church everywhere. And so they have an ecumenical status. So even though they're not ecumenical councils, the teachings of the councils are ecumenical. Now the purpose of these councils was to support the theology of someone called Saint Gregory Palamas, who lived in the 14th century, and to condemn the teachings of someone called Balaam. He was a Greek monk from Italy. Balaam believed that philosophers had a better knowledge of God than the prophets, and he valued education and learning more than contemplative prayer. And he stated that the unknowability of God in an extreme form. He basically said that God can never be known at all, and all we can do is learn as much as we can about him through study, through philosophy and so on. And the problem is he then attacked St. Gregory Palamas and the monks on Mount Athos, because they lived what we call the hesychastic life. They lived a life of solitude and prayer, and they believed that through prayer they could be so enlightened that they could actually see God, not in the sense that you can see his essence, but you can see the light of God, what St. Gregory called as the energies of God. St. Gregory criticised Balaam for rationalism. Balaam attacked the monks for excessive mysticism. And the result of all this was a significant theological work from St. Gregory called Triads in Defence of the Holy Hesychasts. And the dispute was actually a matter of real theological importance, because if God is unknowable, completely unknowable, what's the point of everything we do? If we're never going to know God in the first place, why go to church? Why pray? Why fast? Why do any of this stuff? But Palamas, what he did, it was a case of the fathers being quite imaginative. He had drawn on earlier fathers like St. Basil the Great and so on, but he developed it further. He said that yes, God is unknowable in his essence, that we will never ever come to know God fully. That's impossible. As the church fathers have said, a God that can be comprehended is not God. But at the same time, he said that he is knowable at the same time. And he explained this paradox by talking about what we call the essence of God and the uncreated energies of God. And by energies, this is a strange word which we come across time and again in theology. It's hard to explain, but I would say it's mostly by his actions, by his love. the energies of God. And it's important because he said they were uncreated. And this is something I've been looking at recently, in fact, and it's sort of just occurred to me, and I want to sort of touch upon this today. There's a huge problem in the way Christians talk about grace. And it's I've noticed how influenced the Orthodox have been by Latin understanding. We talk about grace like it's this thing which isn't quite God. It's this created thing that comes and helps us. And I hear Orthodox talk about the grace of sacraments. Right? This is completely alien to Orthodox theology. We don't have sacraments because there's some magic thing that comes from them. The sacraments are part of union with Christ. There is no created grace in the Orthodox Church. There's the uncreated energies of God. There's the Holy Spirit. We can't separate that. The uncreated energies of God are basically the Holy Spirit in our life. But we don't have this idea of uncreated grace. When we say grace in Greek, Haristou, we basically mean his love, his benevolence, his gift. But there's also a lot of this talk of this, the grace of God being imparted, like this magical thing. And this isn't actually very orthodox. And it's precisely this that Gregory was really condemning in the end. That he said that we don't know a created energy of God. We know God himself. And he claimed that, for example, again we go back to Mount Tabor in the Gospels, when Christ bursts forth with light and the apostles are blinded by it. Palamas said that was that the monks who, basically those who became so holy through their prayer and ascesis, were able to see that very same light, which they believed was the uncreated light. In fact, it was the Holy Spirit. And so he basically said, yes, we can see God, we can know God, and at the same time we can't. And I think it is very important because, if, like I said, if you can't know God, it kind of puts a bit of a question mark around why we do what we do, why we believe what we do and do what we do. And if you can know God that easily, then surely we're talking about some mental idol, some created being. So those teachings became very important, and unfortunately I think they also sharpened the divide between the East and the West as well. One final thing I want to touch upon, gosh, I've spoken a lot this time, there's a sort of footnote to all this. I want to mention briefly canon law, the canons of the Church. Because the Ecumenical Councils and local councils, pretty much all of them formulated canons. Now what we talk about, canon law is basically, it's legislation. The canons were rules that were written, because bear in mind that when Church and Empire had basically joined, Church law became imperial law. Right? So decisions were made by the Church, these had to be carried out in practice. And there were lots of different canons. There were canons written by various saints as well as local councils. But unfortunately there has been, right from the beginning, a very legalistic spirit when it comes to approach. And this is legislation, okay, but the purpose of them is to heal the soul. It's not just about a passing law. These rules are there to sort of give us some guidance on how to live our life. Unfortunately, there is a mentality amongst many Orthodox, the obsession with canon law, a very legalistic way of looking at things. You can't do this because the canon says so, you can't do that because the canon says so. And we forget that these canons are not infallible. They are not everlasting like the dogmatic formulations are. These canons were overturned time and again, revised time and again, because as times changed and needs changed, the Church adapted its canons. Again, we see, like I said before, how much tradition is not something stagnant and static, that it constantly develops, it reinvents itself, it adapts all the time. Unfortunately, there's people confuse tradition with conservatism. They're not the same. We don't just preserve tradition like something you put in a freezer. It's something that's alive. And people forget, that the canons are not to be seen in this way. In fact, in the canons of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, the last canon says that all of these canons can be dispensed with or adapted according to the bishop's discernment. So the bishops, the clergy, the spiritual fathers of the Church deem whether a canon should be enforced or ignored, or there was I think Justin Popovich, Saint Justin Popovich, 20th century saint. He's put it perfectly when he said that to preserve the holy canons, I'm ready to sacrifice my life, but at the same time, to save one person, I sacrifice all the holy canons. So, for example, there were canons which said, did I tell you before about Elder Porphyrios, where I think we might have touched upon it, where there was people that would come for him to a confession, and he would look up the sins in the book of the canons, and someone says, I've committed this sin, and he says, well, you can't take communion for 10 years, you can't take communion for 20 years, whatever. And then one day someone comes and he says, when's the last time you came? He says, it's been a long time. He says, why? And he replies, well, I lost hope. He says, why? He says, well, because the last time I came to you for confession, you said I couldn't take communion for 13 years. And that's when Elder Porphyrios said, sod the canons, I'm not going to go by the rules anymore, I'm going to deal with each person individually. And it's important to remember that, because it's about the salvation of human souls. It's not about preserving rules. A lot of the rules are there for good reason, the theological rules. I'm not saying that we just give in to anyone's needs. We have a lot of rules which are not canons, but they're theological rules. For example, in a baptism, the godparent has to be Orthodox. There's good reason for that. There's theological reason for that. There's a theological reason why someone who's not baptized Orthodox can't take communion in the Orthodox Church. But there are no reasons why a lot of things which were written for 4th century day-to-day living, there's no reason you can't apply those things now. So we have to have the discernment to know what applies, what doesn't, what's there for theological reasons, and what's there for practical reasons. And this goes back to what I said at the very beginning, why I believe in teaching all this stuff and all this theology, because we have to be able to discern between what is authentic orthodoxy, what is theology, and what isn't. There are a lot of wrong practices in the church, a lot of strange customs which have nothing to do whatsoever with theology. There's a lot of different mentalities. There's sort of legalism, stringent conservatism. It's not necessarily moralism. And I'm hoping that the more you can understand the spirit of orthodoxy, the mind of the church fathers, the mind of the Ecumenical Councils, the reason the canons are written, the meaning of all this theology, that for you yourselves to be able to discern for yourself. Obviously there are priests you can always speak to and so on for advice, but to learn for yourself, to start to acquire what we would call an orthodox mindset, to think like an Orthodox Christian. And that's very important, because in your own lives, you're going to have responsibilities, you can have children, families, and you're going to have some measure of responsibility and knowledge and understanding of your faith, so that you can teach your own children, so that you can pass this on. So, I'm a big believer in getting people to understand and learn for themselves. Make your own explanation, make your own journey. Don't become overly attached to some spiritual father or priest and think you have to ask him for every single thing. You're going to need guidance, you're going to need help, you can have questions. But I want you to learn for yourselves, to find out more and learn what it means to be an Orthodox Christian. Anyway, I've waffled on too long, so I'm going to leave it there. Any questions? Test. Tell me all the ecumenical councils. Like I said, I have written them down for you in the first handout. If you've lost the first handout, just email me and I'll send them back to you. But you don't have to worry about learning dates and stuff. I'm just giving you an idea of what those councils were about, what questions they dealt with. Fundamentally, they all dealt with two questions really, which was the Trinity and the Incarnation, and even the icons was ultimately about that.
And what was when was it Photius, or who was the one who was annoyed with the third canon? There were two.
Yes,
the Eastern
Photius
and the Western.
Yeah.
And then they reorganised the order of importance, as it were.
Oh, you're talking about the patriarchates?
In 954. Yeah.
I think you might be confusing two different things.
Yeah.
Photius the Great. But the thing about the the sees, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem. These were the 5 ancient patriarchates. That all started with the. I think it was the first. No, it wasn't. It was originally there was a certain order in the first Ecumenical Council. I think it was the fourth, in fact, where they gave Constantinople second place after Rome, before Alexandria, Antioch, and that obviously annoyed them. So there was a lot of political stuff behind. Theology was often used as a weapon, unfortunately, back in those days. And if someone wanted to stick 2 fingers up at someone, they would throw the heresy of accusation of heresy at them. That happened a lot as well. But ultimately, these were important theological issues which were at stake, not just politics. And I can't remember the whole Podios thing after. I'm a bit rusty now with that.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. Sometimes I read it and then it's like, much later on, forgot it. It's so complicated. It's very interesting.
Nothing else?
Well, one thing you mentioned about having, at the beginning, that the Father said, we believe that we have the right Spirit and the Holy Spirit's working through us, and it's more unanimous, but at the same time, there were councils that were unanimous, and they believed they had the Holy Spirit, which were later condemned.
Yeah, this is the other thing when we talk about the Ecumenical Councils. Thanks for bringing that up. Is that an Ecumenical Council isn't just all the bishops get together and therefore it's an infallible Ecumenical Council. An Ecumenical Council, because there were councils that we had that, but the rest of the church eventually didn't accept it. It was rejected. And basically an Ecumenical Council is something, ecumenical as you know means universal. But that doesn't just mean all bishops coming together in one place. It means that the teaching is accepted by all times and places. So you could have an Ecumenical Council and then the majority of lay people just reject it outright. It's not going to obtain an ecumenical authority. Ultimately, I don't like, and it's a bit risky for me to say this, but I heard when I was studying theology, I kept hearing about this, infallibility thing, and it never I was never entirely comfortable with it because it seemed too absolute. I'd say ultimately the church, in its divine nature, is infallible because God is, and the Holy Spirit is. But there are lots of accidents on the way that eventually, I think the truth comes through, but it's never always that obvious at the time. And like I said, you could say, a doctrine is true, but it doesn't mean that everything the church has ever done in any way is always infallible. That it condemn a certain person and anathematize somebody. One of the big issues we have with the Monophysites is that the Orthodox refuse to lift the anathemas on the Monophysite saints. The Monophysites refuse to do that on the Orthodox saints. Why is there this idea that the church can't even make a mistake when it comes to anathematizing someone or lifting or canonizing someone? Surely we can't say that there's no room for error at all in anything. And this again, I think it comes back to this idea of being stagnant, of saying whatever happened in the past is set in stone, end of story. We can't. That's not tradition.
But I think that if somebody modified anything that came out of what we call the Ecumenical Councils, now there's 7, the ultra-conservatives would completely reject that and say that,
Yeah, well, I think there are some people who... Yeah, there are people who are waiting for an excuse to go into schism, basically, and anything council would come up with, unless it was extremely conservative and everything, it would probably do that. So we have to be careful about that sort of thing. But, I don't know if there'll be any more ecumenical councils. There should be. But unfortunately, there has for a long time been this idea that once you had the 7 ecumenical councils, the age of theology had come to an end, all doctrine had been explained, and that was the end of it. But we find again at the same time that was not the case, as we saw with Gregory Palamas. And surely, it's about time we had another council to deal with problems of the day. But like you said, there are people that it could create divisions.
Why is it taking so long then?
Two main reasons. First of all is that one. Well, three reasons really. First of all, I think people are concerned about creating schism. Second reason is the Orthodox are the most disorganised people on the planet, and trying to organise an ecumenical council today would be a nightmare.
I do not think it will permit. Always happen.
Someone told me I got sick of organised religion, so I became Orthodox. The third reason is because of all the tensions amongst the bishops. I mean, right from the day one, the bishops were in competition. The patriarchates were in competition. Traditionally, councils can only be summoned by an emperor. We don't have one, even if people can't accept that the Roman Empire is long gone. So, by default, really, the person that would summon it would have to be the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. That will probably annoy the Russian Patriarchate and the Patriarchate of Jerusalem and everybody else. But I mean, if people could at least accept, he obviously does have the senior position in the Orthodox Church, accept that much at least, and if people can get it organised, there's no reason it can't happen. But it has to be very careful about what it's going to discuss and what conclusions it's going to reach. The thing is, though, you will see, I think another reason, though, I mean, in defence of not holding an ecumenical council, all of these councils met in times of urgency. I mean, there were specific heresies which were really dividing the church. I don't feel that we're in this position at the moment. There are a lot of problems, a lot of questions, but there's this urgency to, like, we must clarify something is not really there.
I understand what you're saying, but there was also lots of these local councils that happened. Like, for example,
yeah, local councils still happen.
One thing is the problem is the calendar, for example.
Yeah,
so they had in the 1920s, I think it was early 20s, when some of them came together, they changed the calendar.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, now it's almost 100 years. It's a serious problem still, and it's annoying.
Yeah.
You know, and it's 100 years later, and
we still haven't. Yeah.
You know, and we still can't clarify that. And that was not. What was that considered?
Yeah.
I mean,
this is the problem with local councils. If they act independently of the rest of the church, and you end up with these disparate sort of these differences. An ecumenical council would probably be able to solve that issue, which would be worth doing. But again, I don't think there's that sense of urgency like there was in these times, when there was real persecution and so on. But it would be good. Local councils go on, but they can only do so much. Like I said, if ecumenically they examined the whole issue of calendar and basically refused to, no one would act unless everyone agreed, would have avoided that problem. The problem what we have is that some people wanted to change the calendar, some people didn't, so some changed it and some didn't. Now Orthodox don't even celebrate Christmas together, and it's ridiculous. So yeah, these are sort of things that Ecumenical Council could solve, but like I said, I think these councils, they only seem to meet when there was that real sort of urgency, and I don't know if it would be in the same spirit if we just got together just to try to sort of fix a few problems. I don't know. But I mean, well, time will tell. I mean, maybe we'll have an ecumenical council and hopefully sort out a few things.
I was going to say, so in terms of the calendar, the local ones that occurred in the 20s, what was the urgency with that then?
Well, local councils are not. I mean, local councils are held all the time. There's no urgency about local councils. Athens, the Church of Greece has a local councils. Everyone does local councils, but most of the time these are things which only address internal issues. They don't address matters of ecumenical importance. So it's strange that the calendar thing is a strange thing because obviously it does have ecumenical repercussions. I don't understand how and why that happened, but what's done is done. But maybe hopefully we can resolve that someday. Okay, we'll leave it there. Next week we're going to look at the 7th Ecumenical Council, the Theology of Icons, and the week after we're going to look at Holy Week, and that will be the last one before